get us started with recording.
Yep, okay, there we go.
Okay, cool, we are recording. Hi everybody, today is Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2018. This is a bi-weekly steering committee meeting, heart you all. And I'm your moderator, Aaron. So we have a couple topics to discuss, to review our in-flight sprint, make sure that looks good, discuss what we want to bring up at the next governance board meeting, communication infra, some code of conduct stuff that kind of came up, and project graduation. So we're going to try and keep us moving through these. Current sprint, I just kind of carried everything forward that we hadn't completed last time. Sent an email about that, sent a pull request out. Sarah, updating project values. Where are you on that?
We have it fairly tuned up. I haven't looked to see if there are comments after my most recent conversation with you and Tim St. Clair. No, yes, Tim St. Clair.
Yeah, I don't think I actually put a P or a note against that, but I did want to.
Okay, so at this point, I confess I can't remember what your we need to make sure we do a thing.
It was around sustainability and making sure we discourage heroes or martyrdom.
Okay.
Right? So this came about where I was talking about how cool it was that somebody had some very high numbers in terms of the participation, and while that might be cool, it might also be a sign that they're putting way too much effort into it, and we would instead like to see the tide rise so that it's a more sustainable thing, rather than focusing on the top N people who are putting in extraordinary effort.
Yeah, and it also relates to the number of people who are the approvers, right? So like we'd rather grow a sea of people who can actively contribute than to rely on the valiant efforts of a few.
Right.
Well, we do have the automation over toil point. It's not exactly the same. That's sort of related. We
also have evolution is better than stagnation, which says community members should be expected to leaders should be expected to step aside, and community members should be expected to step up, which talks to the expected growth and turnover, but it's not explicitly heroes. All right. I will see if I can find a way to put heroism back in here. We had some language about heroism, so I may go back to an earlier draft and look for that and see what I can find.
I think it was with regards to the toil point.
Yeah, I think it was. Okay. What about, I can even just do this totally on the fly, suggesting heroism is not sustainable. So large projects have a lot of less exciting yet hard work. We value time spent automating repetitive work more highly than toil. Where work cannot be automated, it is our culture to recognize and reward all types of contributions. However, heroism is not sustainable.
I like it.
Yep, that's fine by me.
All right, shipped. I mean, I'll go make a pull request or something.
Okay, cool. Intra-SIG governance. So I put this and the SIG charter template both in our sprint because I wasn't sure what remains to be done once the SIG charter template goes out. So what's intra-SIG governance is the big broad thing. What's going on there? I think that's Joe and Michelle and Bill.
So I have that PR. I can link it again. I've been working through a number of the comments, and I think so last meeting we discussed that it should be broken up into a requirements section that basically talks about all the things you need to meet in your charter or SIG government stock, and if you meet those requirements, then we're pretty happy with it. And the templates are really just a way of giving you ways of checking off those boxes without having to reinvent everything yourself. And I also broke it up into several documents now where the templates themselves are separate. So you have requirements, then a short template that is first, so people can look at the short template. And then the long template where the idea is there's some problems that are a little bit annoying, and such as what is really the process for electing new people into positions, and how does it really work, and how is it proposed, and how is it agreed upon, and all this sort of stuff. And so if you're looking for like, oh crap, we need to figure out how to elect someone, is there a step-by-step, like a 10-step process for getting this done? That's there. There's a couple items I think that need to be resolved that are still comments. One is the sub-projects aspects still need to be tweaked, describing in the template how to delegate authority to sub-projects and delegate technical leadership and what that would look like. One thing I think we have resolved is what is the name for the leads that are not technical leads but do the operational and governing stuff, and it sounds like we can't, no one's really happy with anything, so SIG leads it is.
Wait, so what was the result there?
I'm not happy with SIG leads.
Yeah, I'm really not.
Anything other than that name.
So I had made multiple other suggestions. Nobody liked those. Like SIG manager was one.
Shepherds.
I don't know. Anyway, and we can follow up on the PR about that. I do see there's a lot of work I need to go look at again. Thanks. One thing I didn't see the last time I looked at this, which maybe I didn't comment on, is I would like to see in the charters a statement about the scope of the SIG, like what issues is that SIG responsible for, and have authority officially delegated to it by the project as a whole, just to make it clear which things are owned by which SIG, and identifying all the sub-projects as part of it, but it may not always be clear to everybody what issues are covered by what sub-project, and there may not be sub-projects active for all the areas that kind of fall under the domain of a specific SIG. So I think there are a few SIGs like SIG architecture and maybe API machinery that have spec'd this out in some amount of detail, but I think most of the SIGs have not.
So I've had a question come up at me from a couple different SIGs where if we are getting SIGs to dictate what they think their scope is, do they need to run their charter through the steering committee for a final stamp of approval, or what's the process there?
I think we should do that. Yes.
That was part of the original work that we pre-election, was that there would be a ratification process.
Yeah, I was hoping we would not only have the template, but also like convert one SIG's charter into something we like before asking everybody to update their charters. And we could do that with SIG architecture or some other SIG.
She's already working on that for DevX too. She's looked at these and is using like basis or something.
Yeah, I've had scalability and contributor experience both ping me. Like, hey, we did a charter because we noticed Phil put out this huge PR and we wanted to see like what we should do about it. So like putting out a checklist or a template is step one. Step two is giving folks a clear process for how their charter gets approved.
All right, so another thing that I think we need to resolve is how do we track membership, sort of what is the canonical place, owners files versus email list. We've gone back and forth on that. I think I have a topic of discussion later on that gets into that too, so we can punt that to that.
Yeah, that needs to be resolved. I mean, my opinion is neither one's good enough.
They all suck, yeah. No. But I think there may be some, yeah, I don't know. So let's talk. We can talk about that. For me, it seems like the sub projects is just work on how to actually sort of get that stuff spelled out. So it's not. I don't think there's anything super contentious there. I think the contentious thing is the name for sort of the non-TL position, the organizational lead, whatever.
Well, also something about specifying if we're going to document all the SIG members. I think we need to have some sort of positions for people who aren't just submitting technical PRs.
Yeah. So I think part of that is like, what do we call that? I think there's a certain amount of like people who are active enough in the SIG to be considered contributors to some degree, and that doesn't have to be technology. And I know this isn't agreed upon, but my gut is that then the transitive closure of all those people across all the SIGs are going to be the people who vote for like steering committee and are actually become sort of the people with standing. So we get away from sort of the ad hoc stuff that we did last time. And so I think that's why it's important that we actually sort of specify that there is a level of contributor that the SIG's certified.
But yeah, ideally from my perspective, those roles would be as concrete as possible. So we distinguish between like the casual participants who just, chime in on things versus people who are actually doing some kind of useful work, even if it's non-technical. I do want to capture that distinction somehow.
Yeah, but okay. So the interface to the SIG is going to be they should maintain a member list or a contributor list of folks who materially help the SIG out, right? And this can be across whatever that means for that SIG.
Yeah, I mean it could be running surveys, it could be whatever.
And so I think and then we can have some suggestions for the charter in terms of for the sample charter in terms of what.
That feels like something maybe we should attack more concretely when we start talking about members of standing. I'm not sure that it necessarily makes sense in the context of SIG charter, but I'm open to.
Well, so the question is,
you can't make decisions without this.
When we do lazy,
hang on. Why does SIG membership matter?
When we do lazy consensus, who gets to raise a flag and actually slow things down?
Yep.
Okay, so lazy consensus happening over the mailing list. Any old person raising a red flag is not enough. That person has to be somehow vetted as capable of raising a red flag.
Or let's talk about consensus seeking instead of just pure consensus. If you're going to have a vote, that immediately gets you into the question of who's allowed to vote.
And if it can be any randos off the street, you could have like everybody in your company show up to a SIG meeting and actually overwhelm things.
Sure. So that voting thing definitely matters for members of standing in the steering committee election. Are there other SIGs that have this voting problem that needs to be addressed?
No, every SIG has this problem. I mean, when we look at the a lot of the sort of tension that's happening in a certain SIG now, like, having a list of members would help actually provide us moving forward. That wouldn't necessarily have to appeal to the steering committee.
Yeah. It's horrible for everyone now because if you're in a SIG, like you don't know, do I count, do I not count, who else?
Well, you could do. It's typical in other venues to do like +1 non-binding, right, and +1 binding. And the binding are those who can cast the vote, and the non-binding is just like to weigh in to let folks know that I'm listening on this mailing list. I don't have a binding position here, but I'm still going to let my voice be heard.
Yeah, and so if we suggest that SIGs, if they need to come to a vote, it's just the top level people in the SIG, whether it's sub-project owners or whatever, then at least there's a clear list of people who can say yes or no.
I don't think that's within keeping of sort of the way we've run our community. I think if we
I'm just using that as an example.
Yeah. And Aaron, I don't think this is going to be the normal case. I think, in the normal case of business, a SIG having to do a vote on something should happen very rarely. But when it does happen, that's not when we want to be making this stuff up on the fly.
I grant you that. My confusion here is it sounds like Phil is converging on nearly having something out the door with regards to a checklist, but it sounds like this is blocking it. And this sounds
as part of Phil's document is an idea of members in a membership list with approval of that. Am I wrong, or is that did that get lost?
No, that's correct. Maybe we should take a step back. And I put a comment on the PR, but I'm sure not everyone's looked at it. So one thing I've suggested is I have like the requirements piece now, a README, and a short template. And it might be easier to just like converge on those and publish those and say, okay, we at least agree on the requirements of what goes into the charter, and here's kind of a bare bones thing. And then go through and try and later.
Yeah, I think it's fine to leave some TBDs just to get something initial done. I mean, in the previous version that I read, there were just a bunch of issues, and the gap between what was there and the whole sub-project concept was part of it, but also, keeping track of members in mailing lists I have a big problem with as well. So, we could take that out and leave it as TBDs and say, look, there's this problem we know we need to solve, and we're working on that still. I think that would be one way to make progress.
If we need to define members and to use them for members of standing, I would like us to be at least prescriptive in what sort of things we want to see those people contributing. because if we leave it completely to the SIGs and every SIG individually, it will be just as politicized.
Yeah, I mean, that is listed in the long one. There's 10 or 15 items like triaging issues, reviewing PRs, monitoring tests, fixing tests, contributing features, refactoring code, participating in design discussions, et cetera, et cetera.
User research. Yeah, I mean, we got a
good list. Okay.
Is user research on there, Phil?
No, I mean, I'd be happy to add it.
Yeah. Like PME things should count, right?
Yeah, I'm happy to add any sorts of items that are useful. I just don't have an exhaustive list.
Yeah, and that's the thing where I think we really should recommend that informal contributions are fine, but we encourage SIGs to create well-defined roles for things that actually need to be done on a regular basis.
All right, so I'm writing down here that the decision here is let's get something out even if there are some TBDs in it.
Yes.
And so it won't be final, but it'll be like something that we can start having people wrap their heads around.
Would you like me to create another PR with the subset of documents that seems like we could get consensus on within a week's time?
I think your requirements document is probably what we're trying to get.
Yeah, the interface thing is probably the right place to start. Like, what do we expect from a SIG?
Okay, so I'll create a new PR just with that document. We can go from there.
Okay.
The one thing to touch on is, Brian, you're right. Like, there's nothing in here about the scope of SIGs, and originally the scope of this was governance, which I don't think encapsulates the full charter. There's probably, I'm not sure if that falls under governance or it's more of a charter issue, or if we want to expand the scope of this.
Yeah, I was just thinking if we were doing a charter template, that's one of the most important parts of the charter, I think.
Okay, I can think about that and draft something. Why don't we introduce that once we have made some progress on some of the stuff that's here?
Okay.
All right. Next up, Brendan, where are we at with your proposal on the repositories?
I have gone through and addressed all comments. I'm about to push up. I did it just before the meeting. I'm about to push up the response to the comments, and then there was nothing particularly groundbreaking or revelatory in the comment stream. I didn't think, just little edits. So I think once those comments are up and replied to, we should be ready to merge. I don't know by which process we want to merge. Do we want everybody on the committee to LGTM? Do we just want, but I think we're ready to go.
Okay. I feel as though in terms of actually implementing this, we still have some unanswered questions. The biggest open one for me was what we were doing with Teams. So as far as I'm aware, I've set up all of the automation necessary to make things happen. The automation that hasn't been set up is the /approve command and the use of tied to merge stuff. Part of that starts to get tripped up on what we're actually requiring in terms of process and automation of all of the repos that are created in this org. So there's that. And then as far as the teams goes, I put out a pull request with sort of trying to document the status quo where you have like foo admins, foo maintainers for a repo foo. The question is around, do we bother mirroring SIG teams? Because you can't notify GitHub teams across organizations. And you can't automatically voluntold somebody into joining an organization. So mirroring the teams would be some level of effort. So, I mean, optionally, we could say we're going to work on that. And in the meantime, add a foo reviewers team for your foo repo. And people who are interested in working on that repo, join that team.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds good. I mean, I think we could also, if you want, we can put something in the doc that says effectively like, to the extent possible, or the bits of this that are unimplemented don't apply until they're implemented, something like that.
Okay. I would appreciate some steering committee attention on that pull request that I've linked in our meeting notes, and I'll put it again in chat just to try and put a stake in the ground around the teams with foo admins, foo maintainers. I want to use this to rename all the incubator teams to follow this convention and make sure it's enforced throughout the rest of the org.
So Brendan, I had one question. I thought when we last met and discussed your Google Doc before it went in proposal form, we went back and forth on if it was an org per SIG or just one global org to hold SIG-related repositories. Unless I'm mistaken, in your PR, if I recall, you had orgs per SIG, and I thought that was still a challenge for us. Am I
no, in the PR it is one org. We sort of had a consensus that we would start with a single org, and that single org is called Kubernetes SIGs, I believe. Yeah.
Yes.
All repos will live at github.com Kubernetes SIG/SIG name, and I changed it to underscore instead of dash because dashes don't work for packages in both Go and Python. So
okay. I'm sorry.
For project name.
I think I just saw SIG name / project name, and yeah, my apologies, Brendan. That looks fine.
There were some formatting problems. I put like little angle brackets in, and it tried to interpret them as raw HTML. So there were some formatting problems that might have led to your confusion as well. So those are now fixed.
And I assume, like I'm thinking like SIG cluster lifecycle is a really freaking long name.
Yeah, we should probably, people can abbreviate or something like that.
Okay, so we'll kind of cross that bridge when we get to it.
Yeah, I feel like
the API machinery is the one that breaks things.
I mean, I can put a note in there that says something like identifiable SIG name instead of literal SIG name. I don't know. Maybe we can assign each SIG a hex number and they could just use that hex number.
I was going to suggest that.
Fingerprint of SIG name.
Yeah, and we can render it as a color. It'll be awesome.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Do we have a sense of how many of these things will appear? I mean, I've been holding on one thing on a SIG node because I think the SIG repo is a good place for it.
But number 6 have been bugging me for months. I would expect very quickly to have more than 10.
I would gladly talk with some other folks too about shifting things that are out of incubator for folks who are amenable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I wouldn't be surprised that if in a month we have like 40.
Storage, CLI, apps.
I think AWS
lifecycle.
Yeah.
A lot of people have been waiting a long time for this.
So having that influx there is why it's important to me, at least, to make sure that the process for how you get in here is spelled out. Because I didn't see that in the doc, Brendan. I don't know if that's one of the things that's going to be addressed when you push up a change. But this sort of spelled out the what, not necessarily the how. There were just some questions in the FAQ, and a lot of it's kind of left to, we'll figure it out. And I just
the process right now is you need to get SIG approval.
Right.
And for now, anyway, because the SIG architecture / steering committee are the ones who own the organization, you're going to have to basically come to us and say, hey, this SIG is endorsing this person or this repo. Could you create it for us?
Yeah, that's what I want to see spelled out and make sure we're following that.
Okay.
Well, I mean, that's logistics though, like, because we eventually could automate it, right? Like, right as of today.
Yeah, no, I get it. I want to spell out the logistics so that
I don't know. I figure
I don't want to leave. Proposals like this are sort of governance, and logistics should be left.
I was just thinking if we expect a month from now to have 40 of these things, then like 40 people are going to try to come up with the process. So like if there's in the first week we anticipate 20 folks to come out of the woodwork, like we should at least have some, send an email to your SIG mailing list, confirming lazy consensus or consensus, and forward that to the steering committee.
I will send a second pull request with a process appended to the end of this doc after we merge it.
All right. Yeah, it doesn't have to be much, but if it's something we're going to have to do 10 times, let's not figure it out 10 times in a row.
I mean, I think it's basically going to be send email to steering committee with with the SIG that has voted to, or a SIG that has decided to do.
Yeah, and I agree. It's not the end all be all. It's just, let's just start with something so we can iterate on it. Okay.
All right.
Formalizing the concept of sub-projects. So where I'm at right now is I need to go identify all of the owner's files that don't exist and pre-populate them with something. I was going to do this on a per repo basis with the existing people who have and admin access to the repos.
Can we ask them to do it?
Could do that too. I just got to file an issue with them then.
Yeah, I would like to start getting the SIGs and subprojects kind of bought into this. I mean, we've talked about it a couple of times at this point, and I do want to use it as a carrot or a stick, depending on your point of view, before we start creating repos for a bunch of SIGs that they at least need to identify where their current code is.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's fine to start asking for help from the repo owners for this.
Yep. Some on that, and I'm not entirely sure of specific next steps. I know Brian, last we had talked, I needed merging of the maintainers and owners in the community membership ladder.
Yes, I need to write a PR to do that.
And starting to look at the bidirectional mapping between the sub-projects that live in a SIGs YAML file over in community, and then all of the owners' files that live across all the different repos and orgs.
Yeah, and maybe if we can just describe what we think we want, we can get someone from the Contribx or someone else to start working on that, a tool to do that, and what in parallel while we continue to identify the rest of the sub-projects and create the owners' files that don't exist and things like that.
Yep. That's basically all I have to report on that. Okay, time check. Well, unfortunately, Michelle has dropped off. So did we have anything that we should pass along to her offline that we want raised at the next CNCF governance board meeting?
She did drop a note in here about $600,000 to pay contractors and backfill tests and how we might want to work with this.
I can talk about that. Yeah, so we have the initial conformance test suite for certification. Doesn't actually, the coverage is really low. There are a bunch of things we need to do, but one of the things that needs to be done is more tests need to be written. So within the conformance efforts, some folks are working on a proposal to address one aspect of the coverage gap, and the hope is to create something fairly automated and concrete that can get reasonably broad coverage. There is, what CNCF needs is they need the steering committee to approve this. And basically it will come, the conformance working group is going to take a proposal to SIG architecture, and I'm going to say yay or nay. So far I haven't been happy entirely with the exact concrete proposals. So they're still iterating on that. So SIG architecture, would officially make a request to the steering committee to approve that, and we would convey that to Dan. So the steering committee approval is one part of what they need. The other part is they want assurances that it's not going to have to be continuously funded at the same level forever. So we need to put measures into place to ensure that as development on Kubernetes continues, the gap doesn't grow again. So SIG architecture will create some kind of policy that says, to be GA or whatever, you need to have these types of conformance tests. So again, there's some technical issues that need to be addressed that were being discussed. Like, I don't want every feature to be tested by both unit tests and end-to-end tests, for example. So I think we're going to need some work on a test framework that allows tests to be run in multiple modes or something like that in order to address that. But if we make some statements saying that there are optional features that shouldn't be in the default conformance profile. So there are a bunch of issues there that we need to sort through. But if we give Dan and CNCF assurance that we will do something there, we probably don't need to know exactly what, then that will be sufficient to unlock that money. Contractors have been identified, which is why the number is somewhat specific. But there's sort of a clock ticking. CNCF is not planning to reallocate the money, but the contractors, may disappear if they find other work. So That's where that is.
So when you say conformance, go ahead, Sarah, sorry.
Our next actions then on SIG architecture to make sure we get a concrete proposal back to us at the steering committee?
Yes.
Okay.
So the conformance working group, which particular working group is this?
The CNCF one.
The CNCF one?
Yeah, I've been on all these meetings, so I know it intriguingly.
Is it weird that that's a CNCF level working group and not a Kubernetes level working group?
So I've been crossing the streams, and part of the reason for splitting out the SIG testing common sub-project area is to sort of have a landing home for reviews and all this other stuff that's going to be flying through here. Because we have, if they're going to unleash dragons, we need a way to kind of like manage it. So they're trying to get a group together and then punt it back to the different SIGs. I don't think it's unreasonable the way they're operating. I think they're going to tit for tat go back and forth between the SIGs and back within the working group to kind of make sure that they're dotting all their I's and crossing all their T's.
So now my impression, though, and this may not be fair, is that the CNCF working groups are very vendor heavy with a lot of talk and sort of the, and that there's a lot of folks who don't have skin in the game in terms of day-to-day Kubernetes. Is that an unfair impression, Tim?
I think in the beginning it was fair, but I think people are actually stepping up now. Like there are people who are doing a lot of docs work, and if they get those changes in, I think that's a really good thing. And so they've made tooling and they've made modifications, and if they're able to get like an entire doc site stood up, I think that's a good effort. People are making progress. I think in the beginning it was kind of cat wrangling, but I think execution now is pretty good, and identified areas is also good. So it's much better than what it was in the beginning.
I do think it varies more working group to working group than even our SIG variances. So
Yeah, at the CNCF. Yeah.
And it's called CNCF whatever, but I mean, a lot of the people involved, like Tim and people from Google, are the same people who are also engaged in the Kubernetes community. The working group itself does not own any tests or test infrastructure or anything like that. So, if new test infrastructure gets developed, it will be in some Kubernetes repo and it will be vetted in SIG testing, and all the conformance, adding any test to conformance needs to be approved in SIG architecture. So it's not like running completely independent wild with no connection to Kubernetes at all. It's just a lot of the discussion did start with a bunch of vendors, because vendors are the people who are very anxious about it. And we wanted to get their buy-in so that they would actually run the conformance test and try to get certified. So, I mean, we could try to change all the mailing lists and whatever. I don't know how much value there is to that.
I mean, if it's effective, it's effective. It's just, it's a little bit of a strange accident of history, it seems like.
It struck me as weird, but that's kind of where we're at today. And it's sort of like a neutral third party, so to speak, independent of the project, that certifies that everything is okay. So.
Across the vendors, yeah. It also could extend across multiple projects for the CNCF at some point. So I think it's one of the
projects are going to want certification programs that are similar. So
yeah.
It's the first of probably many of these things.
Yeah, so think of it more as the certification working group, because they are the body that is certifying, whereas the conformance tests and the conformance definitions live with us.
Okay.
That is correct.
Yeah, at some point, some simple things we'll need to do is we'll need to ask SIGs to go identify tests they already have that they believe should be conformance, so we can vet that in SIG architecture and get those approved. For example, all the node conformance tests are not in the official conformance suite for certification, and there are questions about, how can we get those into the conformance tests without having them all need to be rewritten.
Okay. Anything else for the governance board meeting? All right. Next up, Joe, you have an agenda item for discussing communication infra and tracking SIG membership.
Yeah, so I kind of stepped in this a little bit. I didn't mean to piss people off. So, I think we have this general theme of we're trying to drive some level of consistency across the project. That's in tension with certain sort of sub projects that sort of have gone their own way, and there's some that have gone their own way, in some ways more than others. Communication methods and styles is one of the things here. I think. And this is a larger issue than just this, is like how prescriptive do we want to be over time in terms of, hey, if you're part of the Kubernetes community, then you have to participate in these ways. But one of the things coming out of that was this question of like, right now we're using Google Groups, pretty extensively. This touches on the SIG, the SIG charter stuff around how do we track membership. Phil's thing out the gate was like, hey, let's use Google Groups as the canonical thing. There's a question of why do we even need groups? And then there's the whole issue of like, well, Google Groups is not really accessible in China, and so that really is exclusionary to a bunch of folks. And there's a bunch of other infrastructure that we have that's not accessible in China. So blah, blah, blah. Do we want to try and actually look past Google Groups and establish something different that is that can be a new standard, and then how much do we want to actually try and wrap our arms around this and for consistency?
How much effort is it worth, I think, is the question, because it's going to be a massive amount of effort.
Yeah, it is. But I think one of the things that we see is that right now, every time we create or manage a Google, like the Google Groups are kind of out of date. If we wanted those to mirror like owners, there's, it's either a lot of work to sort of do to something, move to something that we can automate and build toolability around.
I don't think automation is important personally for that, because those groups contain a lot of people who, may want to pay attention to things that aren't in the owner's files. And I think that's totally fine.
Well, I think
the proposal specifically uses Google Groups as a mechanism for keeping track of who's in.
But I disagree that that's a sane thing to do.
That's a fine argument.
The Google Groups have the same issue that GitHub Teams do, which is they're not transparent. Arbitrary people cannot see who the members are. If you add members, there's no way to make comments about that. The audit logs are not visible by basically anybody. It's not a transparent enough mechanism to be managing memberships of any positions of authority.
So I presumed, Phil will correct me if I'm wrong, I presumed that Phil's proposal implied that this was going to be automated and that these groups were merely a mechanism for being able to reach the list, but the list would canonically live somewhere else.
Yeah,
go ahead, Phil, as we're talking about you.
Yeah. I think that that's a good approach, right? Is that the canonical source is in some other place with a history and whatnot, but that, like, as a practical matter, that we're going to be using Google Groups to reach out to people and invite them to events and share docs with them, and so they need to be up to date.
I think it's fair even I have started creating docs that are publicly visible just because all the sharing requests are a nuisance. In addition to people in China, having to log in to access them, even if they're groups that they're...
Can people in China access docs that are shared publicly?
They can.
They can.
They can.
It's strange.
If they're shared publicly and they don't have to log in, they can.
Okay. So,
but how do you? It's not as an echoing mechanism, but like, I've created a doc I want to share with all the members. How do I? I want every member to look at this thing and know it's there. How do I do that?
Well, okay, so I think one point here is that there's a SIG mailing list that has all interested parties, whether they're members or not, right? And then there's sort of, do we need mailing lists for contributors for the other sort of ranks in a SIG? I think the case there is a lot less critical, because but I also think that there may be cases for that.
To answer Phil's question, why would you ever want to restrict a doc to SIG membership?
I don't think that's what he was saying. I think he was saying he wants to be able to advertise the existence of the doc.
But how hard is it for someone involved in a SIG to just join the SIG mailing list one time?
Oh no, I think that's fine. But I think the point someone said is you need to use anonymous links because anonymous access links are the only ones that work in China.
Yes.
Yes.
And
so those of us who live in places where we can't publish fully public docs, we need to switch to personal Gmails or whatever.
That's what I've done, yeah.
That's fine. I mean, I think it's a reasonable point of guidance to say, like, if you want to share a doc with Kubernetes community, you need to do it from a publicly visible place. That doesn't change the conversation about whether we want to use groups to manage all SIG members or whether we need to at all.
So,
or like calendar invites and this sort of stuff. And I mean, how do you reach out to other tech leads, right? Do you want to have a discussion with the tech leads? Does it? I mean, maybe we could just use the SIG members mailing list and everyone sees it.
That's fine. There are also regular SIG meetings where things can be discussed. GitHub team-wise, GitHub now supports threads with teams, which I found out when people started applying to Kubernetes maintainers. And that actually somehow showed up above the rest of the GitHub notification noise. I should look at why that is actually. But, I think it doesn't seem to come up often. We have the Kubernetes SIG leads mailing list, and yeah, maybe that's not entirely up to date and we should keep it up to date. But I think in practice, it shouldn't be that hard to keep lists up to date, and there shouldn't be that many occasions where we need these kind of private communications. I mean, most of the time, people ping me by Slack if they actually need something, because I don't pay attention to any kind of email from anybody to any list, right? It's true. So you can start a group chat with a small handful of people pretty easily in Slack.
So I don't think we should be prescriptive, I guess is like the general theme. There are so many methods of communication that we now have that most of the time just spamming whatever list has been specified seems reasonable enough to get general coverage. And if we need more side channel or sidebar communication, we do that almost exclusively in Slack today.
I don't want to be retro on this, but the big advantage of things like email is the future indexability of them. I find great value in the fact that basically everything ever sent to Linux kernel mailing list is searchable, and Slack is just not in the same way.
So no, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I do both, right? I do general spamming of the email list and then side channel if there's...
Yeah, but my point is the Linux kernel community specifically says, like, don't do sideband communications for decision-making. You want to do them on Linux kernel mailing list.
For decision-making, sure.
For decision-making, yes. But for conflict resolution, side channel is a good thing.
Like, could we take our SIG governance or steering committee membership and put it in a GitHub team? Like,
GitHub teams are not
we'd want to put
an authoritative source because they have all the same problems I mentioned before. I insist that it must be files checked into GitHub.
Yes.
And they might as well be owner's files if we're going to do that.
Somebody somewhere, one of these $600,000 contractors maybe, needs to be paid to write the GitHub meta organization bot, which reads a bunch of YAML, because of course YAML, and turns that into GitHub groups, GitHub org members, teams, maybe Google groups, whatever else we need to sync it to, but I think the canonical source of truth needs to live in a GitHub repo.
So one of the things that's
on the side. So hang on, we got a couple more things and I do want us to get to them. Like, what problem are we trying to solve here with the sub-projects, consistency, and communication?
Okay. So specifically, accessibility from China with Google Groups is poor. Okay, this is stuff that we've heard anecdotally. Joining Google Groups requires you to have a Google account, which some people object to. In addition to that, and that becomes yet another barrier from China. I think discoverability and listing all these emailing lists is actually difficult. Also, we have some level of consistency with sigs.yaml. But as we introduce sub-projects and mailing lists that might be associated with those, we're going to introduce more fragmentation. We already see this with the Helm folks going off and creating lists under the groups.io thing that's a CNCF started. There's, nothing that'll stop, folks from doing that, but there is a question of like, do we want to make this stuff discoverable, or do we want to have, each sub-project have their own community page and have their own thing? And that's the larger question of like, how integrated do we expect sub-projects to be here?
Is there a viable alternative to Google Groups for that level of functionality?
And then the final thing is that Google Groups, the public Google Groups sucks because it doesn't have an API.
Right. So we can fix that per your proposal before, right?
To move to Kates.io as being the thing that's hosting it. If we're going to do that, I think it behooves us to, but that still has the problems of you need a Google account to be able to actually sign up for this thing. And I believe it'll still have problems in China, right? So it doesn't solve those issues.
Right. So I'm open to alternatives. I just don't know of any.
Yeah, and so one of the things
I don't know that we can expend effort on it.
Okay, guys, 5-minute warning.
I have a proposal. One of the things that we can do is I can engage with Contrib-X and do an evaluation of this stuff that makes sense here. We don't have to act on this right away, but we can at least have in our back pocket that, like, as we start seeing some of these things come up, we actually have a set of options. And I think the two options that are on the table right now would be the groups.io stuff, which is a startup, and then there's Discourse, which is more of a forum type of thing that also can mirror stuff to email. And I believe the Docker community has been using that successfully. So I think it might be worthwhile to explore this space a little bit. I just wanted to get sort of a feel from the steering committee in terms of whether this is totally off the deep end or not.
No, it's absolutely within the purview of contributor experience to solve.
Yeah, one more thing about China. For the people who can access the mailing list from China, the spam filter seems to catch most of the Chinese language emails that are sent. I don't know that it makes sense to have both English and Chinese in the same mailing list. Probably they would want to create their own Chinese language mailing lists if they don't speak English or read by English.
We'll take this offline for now. We can evaluate this. I think the Discourse stuff actually looks really promising, but I don't want to delve into that right now.
Why don't we just start with, we'll put the thing in I'll update the thing to say there's a YAML file in GitHub, and we'll figure out how people are going to communicate.
I think the YAML file in GitHub, and then saying that we want that to drive things like Teams, and then we'll figure out how to translate that to mailing lists in the future, but that's in the future. Okay.
All right.
At some point, we're going to have to actually write this proposal and find somebody to do the work.
I'm sort of trying to scope this on the side for what it's worth.
I signed up at one point and then I failed. I'm sorry.
I want to jump ahead to project graduation at CNCF, the thing that we have punted to the very end of our meetings for the last 2 meetings in a row. Let's actually get to it this time.
What I'm going to say is that Brian has awesomely written a graduation criteria, graduation proposal document. We should send it to the steering committee mailing list today, tomorrow, this week, and to make a vote on it so that it can keep moving. Do we all agree? Enough. So we can make a formal vote on email?
Yes.
Yeah, Quentin also had volunteered to move ahead on it. I stalled a little bit just because it has stalled a little bit on the CNCF side, but I think we're good to move ahead.
Okay, then I will take your doc and send an email to the steering committee public list for vote.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, so to be clear on process, the Kubernetes steering committee needs to vote and the CNCF TOC also needs to vote.
Yep.
The CNCF wants Kubernetes to be the first graduated project as the flagship project.
Yep.
But other projects also are kind of waiting. They're ready and waiting to move forward. So there's some amount of pressure to get moving on this once we finish the thing we're currently focused on, which is revamping the concept of inception level projects.
Right. Okay. Then I will send a mail this week for a vote.
All right. Brian, I know you had an interest in putting the Code of Conduct Committee on our sprint this month, but we have 3 minutes left. I don't see us getting anything substantively done here. I did have something I've been carrying on this agenda for a little while, which is SIG contributor experience under the community management sub-project has been taking on moderation responsibilities and ensuring that each of our communication channels is a safe and friendly place to have communication, including Slack moderation, Google Groups, GitHub issues, all that stuff. Is this within their purview, or is this the sort of thing that should eventually get kicked into a code of conduct committee?
I think it's community management. Otherwise, you're going to have a much heavier load on the code of conduct group. I think the code of conduct group should be simply for full-blown escalations and pulled in as necessary.
Right.
So, are we talking about developing the policy, or helping to enforce community norms, or dealing with escalations, or what?
My only question, I guess my paranoia right now is there's a group of people who are making moderation decisions on behalf of the community, which is great, but there's no like visibility between the steering committee and the people who are doing moderation for us to make sure that things are being done in a consistent manner.
Yep.
Right? I guess that's okay. That's something I would expect the code of conduct committee to care about. We don't have that, so we are the code of conduct committee, and we're just trusting them to do the right thing.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the reasons I wanted it on the sprint is the recent issue with the master rename thing.
Right.
It started to get on the border of getting out of control.
Yep.
So
it did, but we managed to handle it. The other substantive thing is, according to our one and true code of conduct that lives in community, we abide by the CNCF code of conduct, which says to contact only Sarah or Dan for escalation. But we've had people contact the steering committee.
So what I would do, I mean, I don't think we are the only points of contact, but having names is a more friendly way to have this than a mailing list or a group of people.
So this is one of many issues that I think needs to be fixed in the code of conduct, and the CNCF is on board with updating their code of conduct once we have a concrete proposal.
Okay.
Yep.
We are out of time. If there's anything pressing that needs to be addressed before the end of the month, we can figure it out over the mailing list. Otherwise, I think that's got my peace of mind settled. Okay. Thanks, everybody, for a productive steering committee.
Hey, everyone.
Happy Wednesday.
Thank you.
Happy Wednesday.